My wife slid a folder across the dinner table in Pacific Heights and said she needed a prenup to protect her future from my uncertain one. I was 58, retired, and quiet enough that people mistook calm for dependence. What Mildred never checked was that I had sold a logistics company for $12 million 2 years before we met. Let me back up to the morning she handed me that folder, because if you enjoy stories where respect matters more than noise, subscribe to K1 and stay with me. What happened over the next 72 hours turned a marriage negotiation into something her lawyers never saw coming. That February morning started with the kind of polished silence Mildred loved. The windows of the house on Pacific Heights were still silver with leftover fog, and she was already dressed for the day before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. Navy suit, hair pinned clean, phone in one hand, oatmeal in the other. Eyes moving between messages and a calendar that looked like it had more authority than most people. Mildred liked authority. Not responsibility, not sacrifice. Authority. There is a difference, and if you live long enough, you learn to hear it in the way someone says your name without actually looking at you. "You'll be home tonight, right?" she asked, still scrolling. "That depends," I said, "on whether dinner is dinner or one of your board rehearsals." That finally got half a smile out of her. "Very funny, Ralph." She set the bowl down, picked up her leather bag, then paused. "Actually, yes, be home by 8. Specific? I have something important to go over." She said it the same way she said things like earnings guidance or strategic expansion. Clean, bloodless, finished before the other person had room to react. I watched her leave through the front door, heels clipping over the stone entry, and I remember thinking how strange it was that after 3 years of marriage, I could tell what kind of day she was planning just by the sound of her footsteps. When we first met, Mildred told me she was CEO of a mid-sized logistics firm called Voscor. She said it with the kind of practiced humility ambitious people use when they want credit for pretending not to care about status. I liked her at first because she seemed sharp, controlled, self-made. I had spent too many years around loud men who thought volume was a substitute for competence. Mildred was never loud in public. That was part of her gift. She could make a dismissal sound like a compliment. She took me to company galas in San Francisco and introduced me as her brilliant, low-key partner, like I was some elegant accessory she had discovered before anyone else. It sounds flattering until you hear it enough times to realize the label is doing more work than the marriage. Low-key partner, retired husband, solid man. She kept finding phrases that made me sound finished, safe, decorative. And because I didn't correct her, she built a whole view of me inside that silence. What she thought she knew about Ralph Houston that February was simple. She thought I was retired because I was done. She thought I kept ordinary hours because I no longer had leverage worth protecting. She thought the reason I never talked numbers was because I didn't have any that mattered. What she never understood was that I had spent most of my adult life learning that the strongest position in any negotiation belongs to the person who can wait without needing to be seen waiting. 2 years before I met Mildred, I sold a logistics company out of Chicago for $12 million. After taxes, structures, retained assets and placements that had nothing to do with vanity, I still had more than enough to live very well without performing wealth for anyone. I had small offices in San Francisco and Chicago, investments that paid better than most executives admitted, and a life quiet enough that people who valued display rarely bothered to ask the second question. Mildred never asked the second question. She liked surfaces that rewarded speed. I liked people who noticed what was not being said. That should have told me everything. 2 days earlier, my old friend Dave had called while I was walking Clement Street. Dave had known me since before the sale, back when I still ran freight schedules like a battlefield and slept 4 hours a night because that was all growth would allow. "You haven't been out since you sold the company," he said. "I'm out now. Walking is not the same as being out." "What's your point, Dave?" He let a breath out through his nose. "My point is your wife introduces her company's Q3 results with more warmth than she introduces you." I laughed because it was rude and because it was accurate. Maybe she just likes quarterly growth. Maybe, he said. Or maybe you've been letting somebody build a story about you that costs her nothing. At the time, I brushed it off. Dave had always believed trouble could be smelt early if you stood still long enough. He was right more often than I liked. Still, I told him he was reading too much into a marriage that worked well enough on paper. That phrase stayed with me later. Worked well enough on paper. Sometimes the paper is where the real marriage lives. By 8 that evening, the house was quiet again, except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint city noise coming up from Broadway. Mildred came in exactly on time, changed into a cream sweater, washed her hands, and joined me at the table with a look I had seen before board presentations. Not nervous, prepared. Dinner was grilled salmon, greens, a bottle of wine she had opened but barely touched. The food was almost beside the point. She made small talk for 6 minutes. I know because I checked the clock without moving my wrist. She asked whether I had called my sister in Chicago, asked whether the gardener had fixed the side hedge, asked whether I planned to join her for a charity event in 7 months. Then the performance ended. She placed her fork down, reached beside her chair, and brought up the folder. Grey, clean corners, my name written on a tab. She slid it across the wood like she was pushing over a board packet before a vote. "What is this?" I asked, though some quiet, watchful part of me already knew. Mildred leaned back and folded her hands. "My lawyers drafted something." She said it while glancing at her phone, as if legal architecture and incoming messages belonged in the same tier of urgency. "A prenup?" "A post-nuptial agreement, technically," she said, "but same principle." There it was, a correction sharp enough to matter, not just paperwork, prepared paperwork, timed paperwork, structured paperwork. I opened the folder. The first few pages were exactly what men like me are expected not to read carefully. Controlled language, asset framing, risk allocation. A neat summary page that placed her current valuation at $1.8 million and described the document as a prudent measure to protect her future from potential uncertainty. Potential uncertainty. I read that phrase twice, then once more. "My uncertain future?" I asked. "Ralph, don't make this emotional. I'm trying to make it grammatical." She exhaled, patient in the way only a person with a planned advantage can be patient. "You're 58. You're retired. I'm still actively building. Voscor is in a growth phase, and my counsel advised me to clean up exposure. This is normal." Exposure. Yes. That's what I am? That is not what I said. It's close. She looked at me directly then, maybe for the first time all evening. "I'm not risking my future on assumptions, Ralph." That was the line, not the document. Not the valuation, the line. Because people reveal themselves when they stop dressing control up as concern. I looked back down at the agreement, page after page of legal choreography, all designed to define me as a variable inside her life rather than a man standing across from her. She had not brought me a marriage conversation. She had brought me a strategy memo for the orderly containment of a husband she thought had nowhere else to stand. I noticed a second set of annotations clipped behind the summary page. Internal notes, timing suggestions, discussion order. There was even a reference to preserving executive stability and avoiding perception risk if any dispute emerged later. That was when I understood this had traveled farther inside her world than a wife protecting herself should ever need. This was not caution, this was status management. "Who's seen this?" I asked. "My attorneys." "Anyone at Voscor?" Her pause lasted less than a second, but it was enough. "Why would that matter?" "Because I asked." "I had some language reviewed," she said. "That's all." Reviewed. Another bloodless word. Somewhere in that clean little lie, I could already feel the edges of what she assumed about me. She assumed I would either become offended and sloppy or wounded and compliant. She assumed emotion would do the work of disarming me. She assumed that because I did not perform importance, I did not possess it. I closed the folder carefully and lined the corners against the edge of the table. Mildred watched me with the kind of confidence people wear when they believe the room has already agreed with them. I even noticed she relaxed a little, thinking silence meant surrender. "Well?" she asked. I nodded once. Smart thinking. The tension left her shoulders so quickly it was almost funny. She thought she had won something in that moment. She thought I was finally behaving like the low-key husband she had been introducing for 3 years. I picked up my phone, glanced at the time, and called my lawyer before dessert was cleared. The call connected before I stood up from the table. "Martin," I said, watching Mildred reach for her wine as if nothing important had happened. "How late are you at the office?" He knew my voice well enough to hear the part under the words. "As late as I need to be." "Good. I'm coming by." Mildred looked up. "Tonight?" "You said this was important," I told her. "I agree." She studied me for a moment, trying to decide whether I was offended, intimidated, or simply obedient. The thing about people who rely on control is that they usually mistake restraint for passivity. She gave me a small nod, the kind a CEO gives when an underling follows process. "That's probably best," she said. "Get your own counsel. I want this handled cleanly." Cleanly. There was that word again. I took the folder, my phone, and my coat, and left her sitting beneath the pendant light with a glass of wine she had not earned the right to enjoy in peace. The air outside was cold for San Francisco, the kind of February chill that made the streetlights look sharper than usual. By the time I reached the bottom of Pacific Heights, I was no longer angry. Anger is useful only in the first seconds after insult. After that, it starts costing you accuracy. What I had now was clarity. I drove south in silence, one hand on the wheel, Mildred's post-nuptial agreement on the passenger seat beside me, like a confession dressed as legal prudence. Martin's office was 2 floors below Voscor's outside counsel on Broadway. That detail mattered more than it should have. I had chosen him years earlier because he understood something many lawyers do not. Paperwork is not there to end conflict. It is there to decide which version of conflict survives the record. He met me in shirt sleeves with the folder already open by the time I reached the conference room. "You read it?" I asked. "Twice." "And?" He slid the summary page toward me. "This is not a marital safeguard. This is a positioning document." And that was my read. "She frames your future as uncertain, while presenting her 1.8 million valuation as the stable asset base. That's not only aggressive, it's sloppy." "How sloppy?" He tapped one paragraph with his pen. "Sloppy enough that whoever reviewed this thought you were either dependent, uninformed, or too intimidated to push discovery." I leaned back in the chair. "Which one do you think Mildred settled on?" "Probably all 3. He said it without humor. Martin did not perform sympathy. That was one reason I trusted him. He turned another page. "This reference here to executive stability bothers me." It bothered me too. That language doesn't come from a husband and wife legal cleanup. That sounds like someone thinking about corporate spillover. I asked if anyone at Voscor had seen it. "And?" She admitted someone reviewed language, then tried to walk it back. Martin nodded once. "Then your problem is not only the agreement. Your problem is that she has already translated the marriage into a business risk category. There are moments when your own suspicion feels less dangerous once someone else says it out loud. That was one of them." He stood, crossed to the credenza, and brought back a yellow legal pad. On the top page, he wrote 2 headings in block letters: protection, leverage. Then he looked at me. "Which one are we building?" "Start with protection," I said. "Then show me what leverage costs." He gave me the slightest smile. That sounds more like the man I remember from Chicago. Before I answered, my phone vibrated against the table. Unknown number. San Francisco area code. I picked up on the second ring. "Ralph Houston." There was a pause, then a careful male voice. "Mr. Houston, this is Alan Mercer from Voscor." I looked at Martin. He was already still. "Voscor," I said. "Yes, I'm the CFO." There it was. the anchor I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. "How can I help you, Mr. Mercer?" Another pause, shorter this time. "You probably don't remember me. Try me. Chicago, 12 years ago. Lakeside Freight Conference. You were on a panel about route compression. I was still with Harlan Shipping back then." I remembered him at once. Younger, thinner, too smart for the room, the kind of finance man who kept his jacket off because he worked harder than the polished ones. "Alan," I said, "you wore a bad tie and embarrassed 3 senior operators by asking better questions than they could answer." I heard the brief release of nervous laughter on the line. "That sounds right. So why is Voskor's CFO calling me at almost 9:30? His tone changed then, less personal, more deliberate. Because something crossed my desk this afternoon that should not have crossed it in the form it did. Martin leaned back without making a sound. "Go on," I said. "I was asked to review exposure assumptions tied to a marital agreement." "Exposure assumptions? Yes. By Mildred? Through legal, indirectly." He chose each word like he expected them to be replayed later. Good instinct. "And what did you see?" He exhaled slowly. "I saw an asset picture built on the premise that you are non-operational, low liquidity, and personally dependent on household stability. I also saw enough references to timing and executive continuity to know this was not being treated as private domestic paperwork." I let the silence breathe. Alan filled it carefully. "Mr. Houston, I recognized your name immediately. I checked because I thought I had to be wrong. Then I found the old public exit records from your logistics sale, 12 million. Martin lowered his eyes to the yellow pad and wrote a single line under leverage. She never checked. "Why are you calling me?" I asked. "Because if this is what I think it is, then she is moving based on bad assumptions. And because bad assumptions at Voskor have a way of becoming expensive in rooms where no one admits they made them." That was T1 landing exactly where it needed to land, not as luck, but as proof that Mildred had built her advantage on contempt. "How exposed is she?" I asked. "I'm not answering that over the phone." "Fair. But I will say this. There are board nerves around capital posture, more than she's probably told you. And if she is mixing personal leverage with executive optics, then she is creating a trail." A trail, another useful word. "Thank you, Alan. I didn't call for gratitude." "Why did you call?" "Because I watched you run a room once without raising your voice," he said. "And because the numbers in that memo did not belong to a man anyone should treat as ornamental." When the line went dead, Martin looked at me for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "your wife just handed us motive, bad process, and a witness." "Not a witness yet," I said. "A warning. Same direction." He turned the yellow pad back toward us and drew a clean line beneath protection. "Here is the first move. We draft a post-nuptial agreement of our own. Not emotional, not theatrical, surgical." "Go on." "Your separate property gets locked hard. Every structure tied to the 12 million sale, every retained instrument, every placement since. We establish premarital origin, non-commingling posture, disclosure history, and response language in case she tries to recast silence as concealment." "And the leverage?" He flipped the page. "We document mismatch. Her paperwork treated you like a dependent exposure while failing to anticipate the size and structure of your asset base. If this ever widens into corporate spillover, that mismatch matters." "You think it widens?" "I think she already widened it when she let Voskor's side review the thing." He was right. The moment a marriage becomes a strategic memo, somebody always forgets the other person may know how to read strategy. Martin began dictating while his associate joined by speakerphone. I listened as they built the frame in real time. Separate property schedules, non-marital asset tracing, preservation of business interests, protective language around shell entities, legacy distributions, retained sale proceeds, and disclosure rights triggered only under formal discovery. No wasted motion, no bruised ego in the wording, just better paperwork. By 10:15, There was already a draft spine on the screen. By 10:40, Martin had added a cover memo marked Strategy Memo, not for filing, that laid out what Mildred's legal posture revealed about intent, timing, and executive risk contamination. He slid it over to me. "This," he said, "is the document you keep for yourself. Not the court, not her, you. Because once people show you how they frame you on paper, you do not forget it later when they start speaking softly again." I read the memo once, then again. Every sentence tightened the picture. Mildred had not simply asked for protection, she had opened a lane. And now I could see more than marriage inside it. Alan Mercer had all but told me there were bored nerves around Voskor's capital posture. Mildred had treated me like a man with an uncertain future, while her own company was bracing around stability language. That kind of asymmetry interests me. It always has. Martin closed the file and folded his hands. "So," he said, looking from the post-nuptial draft to the strategy memo and back to me, "do you want protection, Ralph? Or do you want leverage?" "Both," I said. By the time I left Martin's office, Broadway was mostly glass and reflections. A few restaurants were still open, a few office floors still carried that late-night blue light that makes every building look like it is thinking about money. I sat in the car for a full minute with the strategy memo on the passenger seat and Alan Mercer's words still moving around in my head. Bored nerves around capital posture. More than she's probably told you. Mildred had built her whole posture at dinner on the assumption that I was the uncertain variable in the marriage. But if Voskor was carrying hidden strain, then what she had really done was walk into my house, place a legal document on my table, and expose where her own confidence depended on other people not asking follow-up questions. That interested me. I drove home a different route that night, past the dark storefronts on Clement Street, and then back up toward Pacific Heights. Not because I was lost, but because I wanted the extra 11 minutes to think without interruption. I have never believed revenge is just emotion with a plan. Most revenge fails because people mistake the thrill of being right for the discipline of becoming untouchable. I did not need to hurt Mildred quickly. I needed to understand the structure she had trusted. Structures are where power lives after pride burns off. When I got home, the house was quiet. The kitchen had been cleaned. Her wineglass was gone. The folder she had handed me was no longer on the table because it was in my hand. Mildred was upstairs with the bedroom light on, probably assuming I was down in the study drafting objections, looking stunned, maybe calling a nervous attorney who would explain to me how adult life worked. I did not go upstairs. I went into the study, opened the wall cabinet behind the books, and took out a black file box I had not touched in months. Shell company documents, retained sales structures, asset summaries. Quiet things, the kind of paperwork that only matters when somebody underestimates the man who keeps it in order. I laid everything across the desk in clean rows. 12 million from the sale had never lived as one loud number in one loud place. People who talk like that usually end up explaining themselves to auditors, ex-spouses, or judges. Mine had been broken into instruments, preserved in entities that served a purpose, and managed in a way that would bore anyone who only understood wealth as display. That was one of the reasons Mildred never saw it. She did not believe anything valuable could choose not to announce itself. I reviewed each schedule Martin had flagged. Separate property, non-marital origin, retained distributions, protection layers. Then I opened my laptop and began reading everything public I could on Voskor from the last 18 months. Earnings language, local business coverage, leadership quotes, expansion references, vendor chatter buried 3 pages deep where lazy people never look. By midnight, the picture had started to sharpen. Voskor was not collapsing. Companies like that rarely look dramatic when they are vulnerable. They look overmanaged, overconfident. Mildred had been talking about growth for months, but buried under the language were signs of strain. Delayed facility upgrades, a quiet refinancing note, changes in supplier terms, and a repeated emphasis on disciplined leadership at moments when no healthy company needs to keep saying the word disciplined. Then I found the number, 4.6 million. Not in a headline, not in any clean public declaration, in a capital discussion tied to a private placement reference and a restructuring note so carefully worded that most people would skim it and move on. 4.6 million. That was not a death sentence for a company like Voskhor, but it was enough to create board nerves, enough to make executive stability valuable, enough to explain why a woman like Mildred might want every variable in her personal life locked down before anyone looked too closely at the corporate one. I sat back in the chair and stared at the screen for a long moment. She had not brought me that post-nuptial agreement because she was simply prudent. She had brought it because she was tightening every visible seam around her before pressure reached the boardroom. She thought the marriage was one of the seams. That changed things. The next morning, I was up before 6. The city was still grey, and the fog sat low enough outside the study windows to make the garden wall disappear. I called Martin first. "Morning," he said. He sounded awake. Men like him live permanently 2 minutes from readiness. "I need a second lane," I told him. "Go. Corporate side, not direct. Quiet. I want to understand who can move in and who wants out." He let a beat pass. "You're thinking equity." "I'm thinking structure." "Well, that usually means equity. Well, can it be done without flagging me?" "Well, anything can be done without flagging you, if you're willing to let other names do the walking." "Well, I am." "Well, then you need a vehicle." I looked at the black file box, still open on my desk. "I already have one." There was a short silence, then Martin said, "Good. Call me in an hour." By 7:30, I had the file I needed open. An old acquisition entity I had kept alive because dismantling useful structures is how impatient people create future problems. It had been dormant enough to avoid attention, clean enough to use, and separated enough from my personal surface that nobody at Voskhor would glance at it twice unless they already knew where to look. I updated the contact chain, confirmed signatures, and sent everything to Martin's team with one instruction. No theatricality, no leaks, no direct trail to Ralph Houston until the structure was already standing. At 9:15, Alan Mercer called again. This time, I was ready. "You said there were board nerves," I told him. "How nervous?" He did not answer immediately. "You're asking me for a line I may not be able to uncross." "Oh, then don't cross it. Just tell me whether the line exists." He took his time with that. "There are directors who believe Mildred has become too attached to presentation." "Meaning?" "Meaning she thinks confidence solves timing." "And timing?" "Timing is exactly what they're worried about." I let him keep speaking. "There's pressure around the next capital step," he said. "If the right party came in with steady money and no appetite for chaos, some people would listen." "The right party," I repeated. "Not a raider, not a clown, not someone who wants a public fight." "Do I sound like a clown to you, Alan?" He almost laughed. "No, Mr. Houston, that's why I'm still on the phone." "How much room is there?" "Enough for a position to matter." "Minority?" "Meaningful minority." 30% meaningful? This time the silence was longer. When he answered, his voice had gone very flat. "That would depend on who else is tired." Tired, another honest word. Boards are built on that word more often than they admit. Not righteous, not inspired. Tired. Tired of volatility. Tired of ego. Tired of being told timing will solve itself. "I appreciate the call," I said. "I never made it," he replied, and the line went dead. That was all I needed. Not certainty. Direction. By noon, Martin had looped in a broker who specialized in quiet accumulations and a second attorney whose entire career seemed built on making large things happen without noisy fingerprints. We met in a narrow conference room with frosted glass and a pot of coffee no one touched. They already had a preliminary map of the board. Alan had been right. The shape was there if you knew how to read it. One long, faithful director getting older. One early investor looking for a cleaner exit. One institutional voice tired of Mildred's appetite for performance. one advisor with no equity but too much informal sway. The company did not need a revolution. It needed one disciplined buyer and one badly timed arrogance. Mildred had already supplied the arrogance. "If we do this," the broker said, sliding a page across the table, "we do it through Voscor-adjacent appetite. No drama, no hint of marital motivation. We are a stabilizing purchaser, evaluating a position in a company with near-term governance sensitivity." "And price?" I asked. He named a range. I barely reacted. Martin noticed. He notices everything. "You're comfortable?" he asked. "Comfortable is not the word." "Then what is?" I looked down at the page. 30%. Enough to matter. Enough to change who gets humoured in a room. Enough to make a CEO hear her own name differently. "Appropriate," I said. The next 36 hours moved the way serious things move, quietly, then all at once. Calls routed through people no one remembers until signatures appear. Offers narrowed, resistance measured. An old holder became flexible when timing was mentioned. A second holder became realistic when governance language entered the conversation. A third did not need convincing. He needed an excuse to stop pretending Mildred still listened. By late Thursday afternoon, the shell structure was no longer a possibility. It was paper. Paper becomes reality faster than emotion ever does. Martin's second attorney spread the shell company documents across the table and walked me through the final sequencing. "Once this closes," he said, "you do not wave it around." I wasn't planning to. Good, because the power here is not in declaration. It is in where the declaration lands later. I signed where he pointed, initialed where he pointed, confirmed the spacing, the numbers, the control language, the protections. Every line felt colder than the last, not because I was hesitating, but because I could already see the room where Mildred would finally understand what she had put in motion. "Done," Martin said when the last sheet was complete. He pushed the documents into a clean stack and clipped them together. 30%. I looked at the stack without touching it. How long until it settles? Long enough for her to keep feeling safe. That was the right answer. I left the office before sunset and drove past Voscor without planning to. The building's glass front reflected the traffic and the low orange light coming off the bay. Employees were still inside. A woman carrying a board packet stepped through the lobby. Two men in jackets stood near the curb discussing something too small to matter and too serious to be social. Mildred was somewhere above them, no doubt moving through her evening like a woman who still believed the post-nuptial agreement on my dining table had placed me where she wanted me. She thought my silence had been the silence of a man trying to catch up. She thought my lawyer was drafting a response. She had no idea that while she was still managing the appearance of control, I had already purchased the right to question the substance of it. I went home, changed clothes, and found her in the kitchen speaking into her phone, in that lower register she used when she wanted people to hear authority without strain. She ended the call when she saw me. "Long day?" she asked. "Productive," I said. "Good. I've got a board session tomorrow. Might run late." I figured. She moved to the fridge, took out sparkling water, and did not ask where I had been. That was Mildred's favorite mistake. She believed withholding curiosity made her look superior. Really, it just revealed which questions she was afraid might have answers. "Did your lawyer review the agreement?" she asked finally. "He did." "And?" I looked at her for a moment. Cream blouse, sleeves rolled exactly once. Phone on the counter. Calm face. Executive posture. The same woman who had sat under the pendant light and told me she would not risk her future on my uncertain one. "He found it instructive," I said. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not alarm, not yet. Just the first tiny crack that appears when a person realizes the other side may not be reacting inside the script they wrote for them. "Instructive how?" she asked. I gave her the smallest shrug. "You walked into this marriage thinking you were the only one with a plan." She tried to smile at that, but it did not hold cleanly. "Is that supposed to mean something?" "Not tonight." I took a glass from the cabinet, set it on the counter, and watched her watching me. She had started this with legal language, because legal language gave her distance. What she still did not understand was that distance is useful only if the other person cannot cross it faster than you can measure it. Mine already had. Upstairs before bed, I opened my briefcase one last time and looked at the board packet Martin's team had prepared for later use. Not to send. Not yet. Just to confirm the sequence. Acquisition structure, control math, settlement timing, governance pressure. 30% through a shell no one in Mildred's daily life would bother checking until it was much too late. I closed the case and set it beside the chair. By the time the board packets went out, Mildred was already walking into a room she no longer controlled. Friday morning came in cold and bright, the kind of San Francisco light that makes glass buildings look cleaner than the people inside them. Mildred left the house before 7:30 in a charcoal suit with a white blouse and the kind of face she wore when she expected obedience from the day. She kissed the air near my cheek, checked something on her phone, and said, "Board session starts at 9. I may be unreachable for a while." "I figured," I said. She gave me the smallest nod and headed for the door. No suspicion, no urgency, no last look, just the smooth confidence of a woman who thought timing itself belonged to her. I waited 10 minutes after she left before I got dressed. Navy sweater, grey coat, nothing that announced anything. I had learned a long time ago that if you want the room to feel the shift, you do not arrive looking like you need the shift to be seen. Martin's car picked me up at 8:15. He was already in the back seat with a leather folio open on one knee and a board packet beside him. "Everything settled?" I asked. "Enough to matter," he said. 30% is in place through the shell structure. Alignment is holding. Holding is enough? Today, yes. He tapped the packet once. You understand the room may try to pretend this is procedural at first. That's what frightened rooms do. He looked out the window as we moved down toward the financial district. Mildred won't expect you there. No. Alan says 2 directors are arriving early. One of them wants calm, the other wants an adult. And which am I? Martin closed the folio. Today, conveniently both. Voskor's building was all steel, pale stone, and money trying to look modest. I had been there before, but only in the ways husbands get invited into places their wives consider extensions of themselves. Cocktail events, holiday receptions, donor dinners where everyone speaks too softly because they assume significance lowers the voice. This morning was different. Security recognized Martin's name before mine. That told me enough. We took the elevator to the executive floor in silence. I could feel the board packet in my hand, the weight of the papers simple and exact. Acquisition structure, settlement language, control math, alignment notes. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just the architecture of a new reality waiting for the old one to walk in. Alan Mercer met us outside the boardroom. Dark suit, tired eyes, controlled expression. He shook Martin's hand first, then mine. "Mr. Houston." "Alan." "They're inside already. Mildred is not here yet." "How's the mood?" He glanced toward the frosted glass. "Careful." "That's honest enough." He lowered his voice. "One director still thinks this can be managed quietly. One thinks it should have happened sooner. Counsel is here." "Outside counsel?" "And internal." "Good. The more witnesses a controlled person has when control leaves them, the harder it is for them to rewrite the memory later." Alan opened the door for us. The room was colder than it needed to be, a long polished table under recessed lights, city view to one side, carafes of coffee at the back, leather chairs placed with the kind of precision that tells you nobody in authority ever arranges their own seat. 3 directors were already there, along with counsel and one advisor whose entire posture said he had spent the last year watching the company become harder to defend in private than in public. Conversations thinned when I walked in. Not stopped, thinned. That is always the better sign. Shock is loud. Recognition is quiet. Martin introduced nothing. He did not need to. Alan moved to the sideboard and took his place near the screen. One of the older directors, a man with silver hair and the patient face of somebody who had spent too many years subsidizing other people's ambition, stood first. Mr. Houston, he said, extending a hand. Neil Babcock. Neil. I wish this were under tidier circumstances. So do most people after timing catches up with them. That got the smallest twitch at the edge of his mouth. Another director, a woman in a dark green jacket I recognized from one of Mildred's fundraiser photos, nodded toward the chair 2 places down from the head of the table. Not at the far end, not as a guest, in the line that mattered. You should sit there, she said. I did. Martin sat to my left. The board packet was placed in front of me before I had fully settled in the chair. A nameplate had not been added. That was fine. Nameplates are for formal comfort. Reality does not need them. The room resumed its low murmur, but differently now, not pre-meeting noise. Calibration. Counsel leaned toward Neil and exchanged a few words. Alan checked his watch. Someone straightened a board packet across from me without realizing their hand was shaking very slightly. The advisor at the end of the table studied me once, quickly, and then stopped. He had already understood the only thing that mattered. I was not here as a husband making a scene. I was here as structure. At exactly 9 o'clock, the door opened and Mildred walked in, carrying her own board packet and phone. She took 2 steps before the room changed for her. I watched it happen in real time. First, the automatic executive scan. Chairs, faces, coffee, counsel, late arrivals. Then the second look. Then the stillness. She saw Martin. She saw Alan standing too neutrally. She saw Neil not rising to greet her. Then she saw me. Not waiting outside, not sitting in a side chair. Sitting at the table with a board packet open in front of me, already turned to the control summary. Mildred stopped so abruptly that the phone in her hand tapped against the edge of her folder. Nobody said anything for a second. You could hear the faint hum of the air system and traffic somewhere below on the street. Finally, she found her voice. What is this? Neil folded his hands. Good morning, Mildred. She never took her eyes off me. Why is he here? I turned 1 page in the packet and looked up at her. Good morning, Mildred. That made it worse. Politeness in a room like that is often more violent than anger. She set her board packet down too hard. No, she said, looking from me to Alan to counsel. No one called me about this. Internal counsel spoke first, carefully. You were going to be briefed at the top of session. Then brief me now. Her eyes cut back to me. Why is my husband sitting at this table? The woman in the green jacket answered before counsel could. Because your husband, through a purchasing structure now fully settled, holds a 30% position that materially affects this board's governance posture. Mildred stared at her as if language itself had become untrustworthy. That's not possible. It is, Martin said. Documentation is in front of you. She looked down at the packet in front of her, then at Alan. Alan? He did not rush. The position is real. Since when? Settlement completed yesterday. And nobody thought to inform me? Neil spoke this time. The sequence required confirmation before discussion. Mildred gave a short, disbelieving laugh that did not contain any humor. Confirmation of what? Some opportunistic outside buyer? Not outside enough, apparently, I said. Her face changed at that. Not fully. Mildred was too trained for that. But the crack I had seen in the kitchen the night before widened into something the room could read. You, she said quietly. You did this. I bought a position in a company whose board seems interested in disciplined timing. Through a shell, through structure. You had no right. She stopped herself there because she had heard how that would sound in a room full of directors and lawyers. No right, as if ownership answered to her preferences, as if process was only legitimate when she initiated it. This is absurd, she said instead. This is a conflict. This is personal. The advisor at the end of the table finally spoke. It became personal the moment executive risk language started appearing in marital paperwork. Mildred turned toward him so fast, I thought for a moment she might actually lose her composure. Excuse me? Counsel intervened gently. Mildred, let's stay with the governance issue in front of us. The governance issue, she said, each word clipped clean, is that my husband appears to have engineered a stake in this company without disclosure. I let that sit for a beat. Then I opened the packet to the acquisition summary and slid it 1/2 inch forward on the table. The governance issue, I said, is that you spent part of this week trying to protect $1.8 million from my uncertain future, while failing to notice that the man across your dinner table had the means to buy 30% of Voskhor before lunch yesterday. No one moved. No one had to. The line landed exactly where it needed to land, not because it was clever, but because it made the room hold both stories at once. The marriage story she thought she controlled, and the capital story she never bothered to check. Mildred's face went pale, then steadied. That is not relevant to this meeting. It's relevant to judgment, said the woman in green, and judgment is relevant to this board. Neil opened his packet at last. We are not here to relitigate anyone's marriage. We are here because ownership, capital pressure, and executive confidence are no longer aligned the way we were told they were. Alan moved to the screen and brought up the summary model. Numbers. Cap table. Voting sensitivities. Governance triggers. Mildred looked at the screen for only a second before she understood the problem. Not every detail, just the shape. That was enough. She was no longer looking at a surprise, she was looking at a room that had already adjusted around her before she walked into it. You coordinated this with the board? She asked. Not with the board, I said. With opportunity. Don't do that, she snapped. Don't sit there and talk like this is some elegant lesson. Then don't stand there and talk like I wandered into your company by accident. That was the first moment the room saw the full reaction. Not an explosion. Something worse. Mildred looked around the table and realized nobody was rushing to restore her sense of order. Neil was calm. Counsel was calm. Alan was expressionless. The directors were not shocked on her behalf. They were attentive in the way people become attentive once a private suspicion has been publicly confirmed. She pulled out her chair but did not sit immediately. What exactly are you claiming? She said. A seat? Influence, said Neil. Review, said counsel. Stability, said the advisor. I said nothing. That forced her to look at me again. Say it, she demanded. I met her eyes. I'm claiming you walked into too many rooms this week assuming nobody else knew how to read paper. She sat then, finally, but it was not the seat of a CEO beginning her meeting. It was the seat of a woman realizing the meeting had begun without her. Alan advanced another page. One director asked a question about governance thresholds. Another asked about the timing of review options if executive leadership needed re-evaluation. Re-evaluation. That word hit Mildred harder than anything else so far. She turned toward Neil. You cannot be serious. Neil's voice stayed low. We are serious enough to discuss contingency planning. Because of him? Because of timing, he said. Because of trust, said the woman in green. Because presentation is no longer enough, said the advisor. Mildred looked at me again, and this time there was no executive polish left in it. Just calculation under stress. She was trying to decide how much I knew, how much they knew, and whether either could still be separated. She could not separate them. That was the whole point. Her confidence had depended on keeping every room compartmentalized. Marriage here, board there, law there, capital there. But the moment she slid that post-nuptial agreement across my dinner table, she had opened a door between the rooms. I had simply walked through it faster than she expected. The next 20 minutes passed in procedural language sharp enough to draw blood without ever raising its voice. Counsel reviewed obligations. Alan clarified exposure timing. Neil proposed a governance committee review. Mildred tried twice to recover the rhythm of authority and failed both times because rhythm only belongs to you when other people are willing to keep following it. At one point she turned to me and said, very softly, "Was this revenge?" I answered just as softly, "No, this was paperwork." That line stayed in the room. I could feel it, not because it was dramatic, but because everyone at that table knew paperwork was the one thing none of them could dismiss as mood. By the time the meeting broke, Mildred had stopped trying to dominate the language and started rationing it. That is how you know a collapse is happening in public, even when no one raises their voice. She gathered her board packet too quickly, nearly left one page behind, noticed, and went back for it. The woman in green spoke quietly to Neil on the way out. Alan gave me one brief nod. Counsel avoided looking at anyone longer than necessary. Mildred waited until the room had thinned enough to make privacy possible without making it official. Then she stepped toward me, holding her packet against her side like a shield that had already failed once. Her voice was low, controlled, and far more dangerous now that the control was costing her effort. "We need to talk," she said. I stood slowly and buttoned my coat. "I agree." She glanced toward the side conference room near the glass wall. "Alone." She led the way into the side conference room without waiting to see whether I followed, which was typical of Mildred. Even when control was slipping, she still moved like the room might remember old habits if she walked fast enough. The glass wall looked out over the city, but the blinds were half drawn, leaving the light flattened and cold. A small round table sat near the window with 2 chairs, a water carafe, 2 untouched glasses, and a speakerphone in the center, like a witness nobody had invited, but everybody had already accounted for. Mildred closed the door behind us and turned the lock with more force than the motion required. Then she faced me. For the first time that week, she looked exactly like what she was. Not a CEO, not a strategist, not a woman managing optics, but someone trying to calculate how much damage had already become irreversible. "How long?" she asked. No greeting, no pretense. "How long what?" "How long have you been planning this?" I set my board packet on the table, but did not sit yet. "That depends on which part you mean." Her jaw tightened. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Answer me like I'm one of your vendors. Then don't question me like I'm one of your liabilities." The line hit her hard enough that she looked away for a second. Not long, just long enough to prove it had landed. She drew a breath, steadied herself, and moved to the table. "Fine," she said. "Let's do this plainly. Did you buy that 30% because of the post-nuptial agreement?" "I bought that 30% because you walked into my house, put paperwork in front of me, and confirmed you had mistaken silence for weakness." "So yes." "No," I said. "Yes would mean this was an impulse. It wasn't." She stared at me. "You want precision now?" "I always did. You just didn't need it until this morning." She pulled out one of the chairs and sat, but not comfortably. Mildred never slouched. Even in pressure, her spine stayed straight, shoulders aligned, hands arranged with intention. It made what came next more striking. She placed both palms flat on the table, like she needed the wood to stabilize the room. "What do you want?" she asked. There it was, the question people ask once they finally understand that the other side does not need noise to hold leverage. I sat across from her and folded my hands over the packet. "That should have been your first question 3 years ago." "Ralph, you wanted a post-nuptial agreement," I said. "You wanted asset protection, exposure control, executive stability, and a legal frame that treated me like a man with an uncertain future. Now you're asking me what I want, because suddenly my answer affects your chair." "My chair?" She almost laughed, but fear took the air out of it halfway through. "Don't be melodramatic." "Within 24 hours, I said, very evenly. "If the governance review moves the way this morning suggested it might, your position as CEO can be put under formal reconsideration." She went completely still. Not shocked. Worse than shocked. Accurate. Her eyes searched my face for bluff and did not find any. "You can't do that by yourself?" "No," I said, "but I don't need to by myself." The room stayed quiet except for the soft hum of the air vent above the door. Down below, somewhere in the building, an elevator chimed. Mildred looked toward the glass for a second, then back at me. "You planned this with the board." "I planned it with documents. The board responded to what the documents meant." "That is a lie." "No. A lie is telling your husband you're being prudent while circulating language built around executive continuity." Her face tightened. "You have no proof I circulated anything. I have proof enough that the wrong people saw enough to review assumptions they had no business reviewing." "Who?" she snapped. "Who talked?" I said nothing. That silence bothered her more than any answer would have. "Was it Alan?" she asked. Did Alan call you? Still, I said nothing. Mildred pushed back from the table, stood up, paced once toward the glass, then back again. It was the first truly uncontrolled movement I had seen from her in years. "This is insane," she said. "You bought a corporate position to punish me for asking for a legal agreement." "No," I said again. "I answered a legal agreement with a better one." "That is not the same thing, and you know it." "You're right, it isn't. Your document was written to protect $1.8 million from a husband you had decided was decorative. Mine was written to protect $12 million, separate structures, and the consequences of marrying a woman who confuses contempt with caution." She stopped pacing. "You hid your assets from me." "I didn't hide anything. I declined to perform them for you." "That is absurd." "Is it?" I leaned back slightly in the chair. "You knew I sold a company before we met. I knew you had done well. You never asked how well. Because I trusted you." "No," I said, "because you categorized me." That shut her up for a beat. She looked at me with something very close to anger, but anger was no longer the main force in the room. Fear was. Fear wrapped in calculation. "All right," she said finally, quieter now. "Suppose I handled the paperwork badly. Suppose I let legal language get too broad. That does not justify this." "This?" I repeated. "A seat at the table? Governance review? Directors deciding they are tired of presentation? No, I didn't create that. I arrived at it. Because you wanted to humiliate me. If I wanted humiliation, I would have chosen a louder method. You sat in my boardroom." "Your boardroom?" "You know what I mean." "No," I said. "I know what you thought it meant." She put one hand on the back of the empty chair beside her, gripping it harder than she seemed to realize. "So that's it? You take a position, you scare the board, and then what? You remove me?" "Well, that depends on what the board decides, when they finish asking whether a CEO who misreads risk this badly should keep speaking for stability." "You would destroy my career over a post-nuptial agreement?" "You keep saying post-nuptial agreement like the paper was the insult. The paper was only the evidence trail." I let that settle before I continued. "The insult was that after 3 years of marriage, you still thought I was a man you could define with one memo and one dinner." Her expression changed again then, not softer, more dangerous. This was Mildred reaching for the next tactic. "Is that what this is really about?" she asked. "Respect?" "Partly. Not control. Control interests people who fear chaos. I prefer options." "And what options are you offering me?" "I haven't decided whether I'm offering you any." That one hurt. I could see it immediately. Not because it was cruel, but because it placed her in the only position she could not manage through image. Dependency. Mildred moved slowly back to the chair and sat down again. When she spoke next, her voice had changed. Lower. Less executive. More personal, or at least more willing to wear the shape of personal if it served her. "Ralph," she said, "if this goes where you think it can go, it won't just touch me. It will touch everything. The company, the staff, the board, our life. You should have thought of that before you translated our marriage into risk language. I was protecting what I built, and I was protecting what you never bothered to understand." She looked down at the board packet between us. Her fingers hovered over it, then withdrew. "What happens if I apologize?" she asked. That was the third tactic. Not law, not authority, not accusation. Calibration through vulnerability. Mildred was good at imitation when she needed something. She always had been. "For what?" I asked. "For mishandling this. That's not what you would be apologizing for." She met my eyes again. "Then tell me." "You would be apologizing," I said, "for deciding I was safe to disrespect because I did not announce myself the way men in your world usually do." She flinched at that one, almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. So did she. "I didn't disrespect you. You called my future uncertain in a legal document meant to protect yourself from me. That was counsel language, and you used it. I approved a draft. You approved a theory of me. Her eyes filled for the first time then, not with tears exactly, but with the pressure behind tears when a person is choosing whether to let them exist. Mildred hated losing visual control. She looked toward the blinds, gathered herself, and tried the fourth tactic. If the board moves against me, you understand this becomes public eventually. Maybe? And then what? People hear that a husband bought his wife's company out from under her. No, I said. People hear that a board reviewed governance after a capital shift and a leadership confidence problem. You enjoy this? No, I think you do. What I enjoy, I said, is clarity. That answer seemed to deflate something in her, not because it comforted her, but because she finally believed it. Men who enjoy destruction are easier to bargain with. You can feed their appetite and redirect it. Men who enjoy clarity are harder. They can sit through their own anger and still choose the cleaner option. Mildred knew that now. She leaned forward and lowered her voice. Can you stop this? There it was at last, the real question. Not what do you want, not how long, not why. Can you stop this? Meaning, are the gears already moving, or can I still buy mercy with the right combination of language? I answered honestly. I can influence pace. I cannot erase what the board saw this morning. Or can you keep them from removing me? Maybe. Or what would that require? Truth would be a start. She laughed once, softly and bitterly. Truth. Yes. You think truth runs companies? No, but lies eventually price themselves in. She looked at me for a long time then, and I could almost see her sorting through every version of herself she might still deploy. CEO, wife, injured party, practical negotiator. None of them fit well enough anymore. That was the private collapse the board never got to see. Publicly, she could still ration words and preserve posture. In here, with the blinds half drawn and the speakerphone sitting between us like dead metal, she had nowhere left to place the illusion that she was still dealing with a dependent man in a managed domestic conversation. I did not think you would do this, she said finally. I know. I thought you would argue, or refuse, or sulk for a week and then let the lawyers sort it out. I know that too. And you punish everyone when someone underestimates you? No. Then why this time? I looked at her for a moment before answering. Because this time the underestimation came with paperwork. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, some of the fight had gone out of them. Not all of it. Mildred would keep some part of herself sharpened, even in a fire. But enough had changed that she looked older than she had an hour ago, more tired, less protected by the story she used to tell about herself. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, you go back into whatever room they call you into next. You answer carefully. You stop pretending this is a conflict caused by emotion, and you understand that your position is no longer secured by habit. And at home? That was the closest she had come to sounding like a wife since we entered the room. At home, I said, we stop speaking as if the marriage exists in a separate building from the rest of your character. She looked down at the table. I made a mistake. Several. Ralph, several. A long silence passed after that. Then she asked the question she had been circling since the moment she saw me in the boardroom. Are you going to take the company from me? It was asked quietly, no theatrics, no performance, just fear finally stripped of branding. I thought about answering in a dozen ways and chose the simplest one. That depends on whether the board decides the company is still yours to run. Her mouth tightened. You could push them. Yes. Will you? I stood, picked up the board packet, and slid the chair back into place. That depends on what the next 24 hours reveal. The words hit exactly as they needed to. 24 hours. Not abstract risk, not someday. A clock, something measurable, something she could hear ticking. Mildred remained seated. You're leaving? We've said what matters. No, she said. And there was one last flicker of the old command in it. No, we haven't. Tell me what this was really for. I rested my hand on the door handle and looked back at her. You wanted to know what I wanted. Here it is. I wanted you to understand that quiet is not emptiness. that restraint is not dependence, and that the man you tried to manage with paper was always dangerous in exactly the way you never bothered to check. She stared at me, and for the first time since I had known her, she had no immediate answer, no redirect, no polished line, no executive phrasing to buy a second advantage, just the full private realization that the board could review her, the directors could move, the lawyers could restructure, and that the husband she had tried to place beneath her with one document had the power to let it all happen. I opened the door, then stopped long enough to give her the only closing I had ever intended to give. A quiet man with better paperwork is more dangerous than a loud one with wounded pride.